The steel tube rested against a sandbag wall, 5 feet of olive drab metal weighing just over 13 pounds, cold to the touch in the Belgian winter. Its mouth gaped 3 inches wide, a smooth bore that looked more like a length of plumbing pipe than a weapon of war. The M1A1 bazooka sat there unused, abandoned by a gunner who had crawled forward with his rifle instead. Because everyone knew what the weapon manual didn't say. If you wanted to kill a Tiger tank with bazooka, you had to get close enough to see the faces of the men you were about to burn alive. Outside the building where the weapon sat idle, 3 Tiger tanks ground forward through the snow toward the American positions at Carano, Italy. Each weighed 56 tons. Each mounted an 88mm gun capable of punching through 4 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. Each carried frontal armor plates 100mm thick, nearly 4 inches of hardened steel that could shrug off hits from the American 75mm Sherman tank gun. The German crews inside those machines knew they were driving fortresses. They had learned this truth through months of combat, where British and American tanks burned while Tigers advanced. The psychological advantage was as thick as the armor itself. Technical Sergeant Van Barfoot watched those tanks coming. May 23rd, 1944, mid-morning, southern Italy, and his platoon had been overrun once already that day. He had spent the early hours crawling through a minefield alone, taking out German machine gun nests with hand grenades and his Thompson submachine gun, capturing 17 prisoners. Now, hours later, exhausted, he watched the counterattack materialize with the slow mechanical inevitability of an execution. 3 Tigers advancing directly at his position. Behind them, German infantry moving in support. His men were dug in, but dug-in positions meant nothing when a Tiger's 88mm gun could demolish a building with 3 shots. The Army had given them weapons for this scenario. The standard-issue anti-tank rifle grenade could penetrate maybe an inch of armor on a perfect day. Useless. The 37mm anti-tank gun, which soldiers bitterly called a door knocker, could punch through 2 inches of plate if you hit it square and close. Also useless. The 57mm anti-tank gun was better, but it was a towed piece, heavy, immobile, and the Tigers were already past where those guns could be brought to bear. Tank destroyers existed, mobile platforms mounting 76mm or 90mm guns, but they weren't here. The Air Force could provide ground attack support with rockets and bombs, but the weather had closed in and the fighters were grounded. What Barfoot had available was that bazooka leaning against the sandbags, the M1A1 model, 2.36 inches in diameter, firing a rocket designated the M6A3. The rocket weighed 3.5 pounds. Its warhead contained 8 ounces of penalite explosive wrapped around a copper cone. This was a shaped charge, a high explosive anti-tank round, designed to function through what engineers call the Monroe effect. When detonated, the explosive collapsed the copper cone inward and forward, creating a jet of superplastic metal moving at speeds exceeding 25,000 feet per second. This jet, though weighing only a few ounces, could burn through armor not by impact but by hydrodynamic penetration. The copper didn't stay solid but became something between liquid and plasma, a cutting torch concentrated into a point narrower than a pencil. On paper, the M6A3 rocket could penetrate 4 inches of rolled homogeneous armor under ideal conditions. For inches, the Tiger's frontal armor was 3.9 inches thick, theoretically possible. But the field manuals and the training instructors and the officers who had never fired the weapon in combat all said the same thing. Do not engage heavy tanks from front. The angle of impact matters. The distance matters. The type of armor matters. Face-hardened armor is different from rolled homogeneous armor, and the Germans use both. And even if you penetrate, there's no guarantee of a kill. You might punch a hole and hit nothing vital. You might disable a track. You might kill one crew member while the other for keep fighting. The doctrine was clear. Bazookas were for flanking attacks. Get to the side where the Tiger's armor thinned to 80mm on the upper hull, 60mm on the lower hull. Get to the rear where the engine compartment offered a target that would burn. Use terrain. Use cover. Use patience. Wait for the right shot. The manual recommended engagement ranges of 100 to 300 yards for best effect. with 300 being far preferable because at that distance the tank's machine guns were less accurate, and the main gun might not spot you before you could fire and displace. Every piece of official guidance said what Barfoot was considering doing was tactically unsound. Van Barfoot picked up the bazooka. He found a soldier who could load it. The weapon required a two-man team, the gunner and the loader who dropped the rocket into the rear of the tube, attached the electrical firing wire to the contact post, tapped the gun on the shoulder to signal ready. Barfoot walked out of the building and moved directly in front of the advancing Tigers, not to the flank, not to concealed terrain. He walked forward until he stood 75 yards from the lead tank, fully exposed, the only cover being the smoke and dust of battle. 75 yards, 225 feet, less than the length of a football field, close enough that he could see the details of the tank's construction, the way the armor plates joined at the hull, the slots of the driver's vision port, the long barrel of the 88mm gun tracking across the battlefield, close enough that the German machine gunner could see him clearly once someone pointed out the American standing there with a tube on his shoulder. The calculation Barfoot made in those seconds was not the one taught in training. He knew the frontal armor was too thick. He knew the manual said not to do this. But he also knew something the manual writers didn't. The manual was written by men who had tested the weapon against stationary targets on a firing range. The tanks he faced were moving. They were buttoned up, visibility limited to narrow vision slits. The commander wasn't standing in the turret with binoculars. This was active combat, and the hatches were closed. The psychological dynamic favored the defender if the defender struck first, and struck with violence that created confusion. Barfoot aimed low, not at the frontal glassy plate, where the armor was thickest, not at the gun mantlet, where the curved steel could deflect the shaped charge jet. He aimed at the junction between the hull and the track assembly. The M6A3 rocket left the tube with sound like ripping canvas, the rocket motor igniting after it cleared the muzzle to prevent the backblast from killing the gunner. The rocket flew straight. The bazooka was smoothbore and had no rifling, so accuracy depended entirely on the fin, assembly keeping the projectile stable. At 75 yards, the flight time was less than a second. The warhead struck the track, assembly on the right side of the lead Tiger. The shaped charge detonated. The copper jet penetrated the track links and kept going, burning into the drive sprocket mechanism. The tank's right track separated. The Tiger slewed violently to the right, the left track still driving while the right side lost power. The driver tried to compensate, but 56 tons of armor, moving at 6 miles per hour, doesn't stop instantly. The Tiger's momentum carried it into a drainage ditch at the side of the road. The hull tilted. The tank wasn't destroyed. The crew was still alive, the engine still running. But it was immobilized, the main gun pointed at the sky, useless. The other two Tigers saw their lead vehicle disabled. They changed direction, turning toward the flanks, trying to bypass the killing ground. This was the critical moment. A immobilized tank still had a crew, and crews could dismount and fight as infantry, or they could attempt to repair the damage, or they could man the tank's machine guns and provide covering fire. Barfoot ran forward. The German tank commander pushed open his hatch, trying to assess the damage, trying to organize his crew for dismount. Barfoot shot him with the Thompson submachine gun from 30 yards. Then he shot the two other crew members who appeared in the hatches. The .45 caliber rounds didn't penetrate the tank, but they killed the men, and men were always more vulnerable than machines. The remaining crew abandoned the vehicle and ran. Behind them, the other two Tigers withdrew. They had armor and guns and superiority in every technical specification, but they had just watched a single infantryman destroy their lead tank at point-blank range with a weapon that wasn't supposed to work, and the psychological calculation changed. If the Americans were willing to engage at 75 yards with bazookas, what else were they willing to do? The Tigers pulled back. This should have been an isolated incident, a single moment of battlefield audacity that proved nothing except that luck exists. But it kept happening. December 21st, 1944, Malmedy, Belgium, 0500 hours, and Private First Class Francis Curry was awake when the German counterattack began. The Battle of the Bulge was 4 days old. His platoon was holding a strong point near a bridge crossing when the Tigers came through the pre-dawn darkness. For tanks, infantry following, The American tank destroyers positioned to cover the bridge took hits and withdrew. The anti-tank guns were overrun. The German tanks advanced to the American positions, and the infantry fell back to a factory building. Curry found a bazooka sitting in the corner of the building. No operator, just a weapon. He crossed the street under fire to grab rockets from a supply point. Rockets came in wooden crates, 2 to a crate, each rocket 3 feet long, and too awkward to carry more than a few at a time. He loaded an armful and ran back while German machine gun fire tracked him across the open ground. He found another soldier to act as loader. They moved to a window facing the street where a Tiger was advancing past a row of buildings. The manual said 300 yards. The tank was 150 yards away and closing. The manual said side shots. They had a frontal angle, maybe 20 degrees off-center. The manual said prepare a covered firing position. The window was open to return fire. Curry fired anyway. The rocket hit the Tiger in the front slope, not the ideal target, but close enough to the side that the armor was transitioning from 100 millimeters to 80 millimeters. The shaped charge penetrated. The tank stopped. Smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. Either the penetrating jet had damaged something vital, or the crew was creating a smoke screen for dismount. Either way, the tank wasn't moving. Curry shifted position. 3 German soldiers appeared in a doorway 50 yards away. He shot them with his bar, Browning automatic rifle, the platoon's light machine gun, 1 man with a bazooka and a bar, holding off an armored attack. He crossed the street again, this time to a knocked-out American vehicle where he grabbed a handful of M9A1 anti-tank rifle grenades. These were different from the bazooka rockets. Smaller, designed to be launched from a rifle's muzzle using a blank cartridge. Penetration was maybe an inch of armor, useless against a Tiger frontally, but potentially effective against vision ports and hatches. Another Tiger was moving up, infantry clustered behind it, using the tank as cover. Curry couldn't get a clean shot at the tank's vulnerable points, but he could hit the infantry. He launched the rifle grenades into the cluster of men. The Germans scattered. The tank crew, realizing they had lost their infantry support, buttoned up completely. A tank without infantry support is vulnerable. The crew's visibility is limited to narrow periscopes and vision blocks, and a man can get close enough to climb onto the hull and drop grenades through hatches or shoot into vision ports. Curry climbed onto an abandoned American half-track in full view of the German positions. He manned the half-track's .50 caliber machine gun and fired into the house where German infantry had taken position. The heavy machine gun's bullets punched through the brick walls. The Germans inside withdrew. Now he saw 5 American soldiers who'd been pinned down by German fire for hours. They were in a building surrounded by German positions, unable to move without being killed. Curry realized they couldn't escape until he suppressed enough enemy fire to create an opening. He moved to another position where another American machine gun sat unmanned. Its crew killed earlier in the battle. He got behind the gun and provided covering fire while the 5 trapped soldiers ran across open ground to safety. 2 were wounded. All 5 made it because 1 man kept firing while they ran. The Germans, having lost their tanks and taken heavy infantry casualties, withdrew from that sector. The cost achieved this: 1 soldier, 1 bazooka, a handful of rockets. The pattern was establishing itself. Not in Doctrine, not in official after-action reports filed by colonels at division headquarters. The pattern was establishing itself in the field among the sergeants and privates and junior officers who actually had to fight the Tigers with whatever tools the Army gave them. The pattern said, the bazooka can kill a Tiger if you're willing to get close enough to smell the diesel exhaust and hear the crew shouting inside. The manual said don't do this. The men fighting did it anyway because the alternative was to let the Tigers advance unopposed. August 17th, 1944. Falaise Gap, France, and the German army was trapped in a pocket with Allied forces crushing in from all sides. Technical Sergeant Charles Carey's platoon was defending a position when 200 German infantry and 12 tanks attacked, including at least 1 Tiger. The attack was desperate. The Germans tried and break out of the encirclement before the pocket closed completely. They overran part of the American position. Carey was in command of an anti-tank platoon, which meant he had bazookas and rifles and not much else. A Tiger advanced toward its position. Protocol said engage with a 57mm anti-tank gun if you had one, or call for tank destroyer support, or withdraw and let armor fight armor. Carey held his fire until the Tiger was close. Close enough that the crew felt safe. Close enough that they weren't scanning for infantry threats, because surely no infantryman would be stupid enough to engage a Tiger from that range. Carey fired from a position where the Tiger's side armor was partially exposed. The rocket hit below the turret, in the hull side where the 80mm plate could be defeated by a good hit. The tank stopped. The crew bailed out. Carey shot at them with his rifle, killing part of the crew. The tank sat there immobilized. 42 tons of German engineering, defeated by a weapon that cost the American taxpayer about $25 to manufacture. The Germans launched another wave. For more tanks advancing, Carey used a bazooka and anti-tank grenades. One Mark IV tank took a hit, and the crew abandoned it. Another tank's crew dismounted and retreated without their vehicle. A third tank withdrew after seeing what happened to the others. The psychological impact was becoming more significant than the raw technical capability. German tank crews learned that American infantry had a weapon that could kill them at ranges where the tank's advantages, armor, firepower, mobility, became liabilities. At 300 yards, a Tiger was invulnerable to a bazooka. At 75 yards, a Tiger crew was trapped inside a steel coffin with an American infantryman outside deciding when to light the fuse. The Germans were not stupid. They recognized the threat when it killed them repeatedly. Captured American bazookas were shipped back to Germany for examination. German engineers studied the shaped charge design, the rocket motor, the firing mechanism. They created their own version, the Panzerschreck Tank Terror, which fired a larger 88mm rocket with greater penetration. The Panzerschreck was heavier than the bazooka, less portable, more dangerous to fire because the backblast was stronger, but it could penetrate 230mm of armor. The Germans created a better weapon by copying the American design, and then concluded, with typical German logic, that the American bazooka represented an unfair advantage. The complaint showed up in interrogation reports. German prisoners, when asked about weapons they feared most, listed the bazooka alongside American artillery and fighter bombers. Not because the bazooka was technically superior. It wasn't. Not because it could engage at long range. It couldn't. They feared it because it gave every American infantry squad the capability to kill a tank at close range, which meant German armor couldn't operate safely even in areas that appeared to be clear of anti-tank guns. A rifle squad with bazooka could hide in a building or a tree line, wait for a tank to pass, and shoot in the rear with the armor within, and the engine was vulnerable. The German complaint about unfairness revealed something about the German military mindset in 1944. They had designed the Tiger to be invulnerable from the front, and frontally it was nearly impossible to kill with the weapons most Allied units carried. But invulnerability from the front meant nothing when American infantry doctrine emphasized flanking attacks, fire and maneuver, combined arms coordination. The bazooka fit perfectly into that doctrine because it was light enough for 2 men to carry, simple enough to operate with minimal training, and powerful enough to force tank crews to consider whether advancing was worth the risk. January 18th, 1945, La Gleize, Belgium, and the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. The Germans had launched their last great offensive, and it had failed. American troops held a disabled King Tiger tank, Tiger II, the upgraded version with even thicker armor. The glacis plate on the King Tiger was 150mm thick, 6 inches of hardened steel. Men from the 82nd Airborne Reconnaissance Platoon decided to test their weapons against it. They set up the test methodically. One team with a bazooka, another team with a captured German Panzerschreck. They wanted to know the truth about what these weapons could actually do, not what the manual claimed they could do. They fired at the frontal armor from a range of about 100 yards. Both weapons penetrated 4 inches into the plate. Neither fully penetrated the 6-inch frontal armor, but both created spalling on the interior. Fragments of steel breaking off the inside surface and ricocheting around the crew compartment. And both penetrated completely through the side turret armor, which was 80mm thick. The test confirmed what the veterans already knew from experience. You couldn't kill a King Tiger from the front with a bazooka, Not reliably. You could damage it, maybe disable systems. Definitely terrify the crew when the interior of their tanks suddenly filled with fragments of copperjet and steel spall. From the side, you could kill it outright. The lesson was tactical, not technical. Get to the flank. Accept that this means danger, because getting the flank means exposing yourself to fire while you maneuver. Do it anyway. April 3rd, 1945, and the war in Europe was weeks from ending. Sergeant John Dolan, 80th Infantry Division, stopped 2 Tiger tanks with a bazooka. The details of this action were never fully documented. No Medal of Honor nomination, no official citation, just a mention in unit records and veteran testimony. Dolan was guarding a position when the Tigers appeared. He engaged them at close range. Both tanks withdrew after the engagement. Whether he scored mobility kills or whether the German crews decided that discretion was the better part of valor, the result was the same. 2 Tigers driven off by 1 sergeant with a tube launcher and a handful of rockets. The cumulative effect of these actions, Barfoot, Curry, Carey, Dolan, and dozens of others whose names didn't make it into the history books, was to change German armor tactics in the final months of the war. Tiger crews became more cautious. They waited for infantry support before advancing into areas where American infantry might be dug in. They avoided towns and villages where bazookamen could be hiding in buildings. They stayed on roads where their speed and mobility gave them advantage. The psychological balance shifted. The Tiger was still the most powerful tank on the battlefield in raw technical terms, but raw technical specifications meant nothing if the crew was too afraid to press the attack. The American Army officially took notice in June 1944 after reports from Italy, Sicily, and Normandy showed that bazookas were achieving kills against heavy armor far beyond their supposed capability. The Ordnance Department investigated. They interviewed soldiers who had used the weapon in combat. They examined knocked-out German tanks. They found that the bazooka's effectiveness came from factors the initial designers hadn't fully considered. The willingness of American infantry to close to suicidal ranges, the vulnerability of vision ports and hatches, and track assemblies, the psychological impact of shaped charge detonations on crew morale, and the simple fact that tanks are complex machines with many points of failure. A major at Aberdeen Proving Ground wrote a memo suggesting that field reports of bazooka effectiveness against Tigers were exaggerated or based on lucky shots. A colonel who had commanded infantry in Italy wrote a response. On May 23, 1944, Sergeant Van Barfoot disabled a Tiger tank from 75 yards with a single shot from a 2.36-inch rocket launcher. He then killed the crew when they dismounted. 2 other Tigers withdrew without engaging. Enemy losses: 1 Tiger destroyed, 2 Tigers driven off, estimated 8 enemy infantry killed. Friendly losses: 0. I recommend the Major review his understanding of what constitutes lucky. The debate within the Ordnance Department revealed a fundamental disconnect between the men who designed weapons and the men who used them. Designers thought in terms of penetration tables and armor thickness, and engagement ranges derived from testing. Soldiers thought in terms of, I can carry this weapon myself without a vehicle, I can hide in places a tank can't go, I can shoot and displace before a turn fire arrives, and if I'm willing to get close enough to smell the tank's exhaust, I can probably kill it or at least scare the crew into withdrawing. The Army didn't change the official engagement doctrine in the field manuals. Officially, the M1A1 bazooka was rated for 4 inches of penetration at 90-degree impact angle, effective range 300 yards, recommended use against light tanks and fortifications. But the Army did authorize development of a larger 3.5-inch bazooka, the Super Bazooka, which fired a rocket capable of penetrating 11 inches of armor. This weapon wouldn't be ready until after Germany surrendered, but it would see extensive use in Korea against T-34 tanks. The Germans, meanwhile, kept using the term unfair in interrogation reports even as the Reich collapsed around them. It wasn't that the bazooka violated any law of war. It was a legitimate anti-tank weapon. It was that the bazooka violated their expectation of how armor combat should work. They had built the Tiger to dominate the battlefield through superior firepower and protection. The Americans built a cheap tube that turned any infantryman into a tank killer, and then trained those infantrymen to accept casualties in exchange for kills. The statistics tell part of the story. The Germans produced about 1,300 Tiger I tanks during the entire war. Each cost approximately 300,000 Reichsmarks, roughly $500,000 in equivalent modern purchasing power when you account for the industrial capacity required. The Americans produced 476,628 M6 series bazooka rockets. Each cost about $5 to manufacture. The cost-exchange ratio was absurd. You could produce 100,000 bazooka rockets for the price of one Tiger tank. If even 1% of those rockets achieved kills, you destroy 1,000 tanks for the price of building one. But the real impact wasn't economic. It was tactical. The bazooka gave American infantry a tool that changed how they thought about armor. Before the bazooka, encountering a Tiger meant calling for tank destroyer support or air support or artillery, and hoping those assets arrived before the Tiger destroyed your position. After the bazooka, encountering a Tiger meant grabbing the launcher and trying to get close enough for a shot. This aggressive mindset permeated American infantry tactics throughout the war. German soldiers in interrogation reports commented repeatedly on the willingness of American infantry to attack positions that should have been defended. Part of this was American industrial superiority. You could afford to be aggressive when you knew replacements and ammunition were always available. Part of it was the weapons themselves, tools like the bazooka that rewarded aggression and punished passivity. The irony is that the bazooka's designers never intended it to kill Tigers. The weapon was developed in 1942 when the heaviest German tank in service was a Panzer IV with 80 millimeters of frontal armor. The design goal was a man-portable weapon that could defeat that level of protection at reasonable combat ranges. Nobody in 1942 knew that Germany would produce 60-ton heavy tanks with 100 millimeters frontal armor. The fact that the bazooka proved effective against Tigers anyway says more about how the weapon was employed than about its raw technical capability. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, who commanded Army ground forces during much of the war, opposed developing heavier American tanks with bigger guns. His argument was that mobility and numbers mattered more than armor thickness. Give infantry the tools to kill tanks, and then let armor focus on exploitation and pursuit rather than tank versus tank combat. This doctrine was controversial. American tankers hated going into combat in Shermans against Tigers. But from an infantry perspective, it made sense. The bazooka was McNair's doctrine made physical, a cheap, light, portable weapon that let infantry defend themselves against armor without waiting for their own tanks to arrive. Van Barfoot retired as a colonel in 1974 after serving in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He lived in Virginia, tended a farm, and rarely spoke about the war. In 2009, at age 90, he got into a dispute with his homeowners association over a flagpole he erected in his front yard. The association said the flagpole violated aesthetic guidelines. Barfoot said he earned the right to fly the American flag on the property. The media picked up the story. The association, facing public backlash and criticism from senators in the White House, backed down. Barfoot kept his flagpole. He died in 2012. In the obituaries and memorial services, people mentioned the Medal of Honor, the flagpole controversy, the 34 years of military service. What they didn't mention was that moment on May 23, 1944, when he stood 75 yards from a Tiger tank with a weapon the manual said couldn't kill it, and killed it anyway because the alternative was letting it kill his men. That moment wasn't glory. It was calculation. It was accepting that close enough to see the tank clearly meant close enough for the tank to see you, and choosing to take the shot anyway. Francis Curry worked as a counselor at a Veterans Affairs hospital after the war, helping other veterans adjust to civilian life. He ran a landscaping business. He booked conventions at a hotel in South Carolina. He died in 2019 at age 94, one of the last 3 living World War II Medal of Honor recipients. In his later years, when people asked about the war, he described December 21st, 1944, in technical terms, the positions he took, the weapons he used, the tactical situation. What he didn't describe was a fear. Not fear of dying, which is universal in combat, but fear of failing, fear that if he didn't stop those tanks, his friends would die. The Medal of Honor citation mentions that he rescued 5 trapped soldiers. It doesn't mention that he knew their names, had shared rations with them, had trained them in England before the invasion. It doesn't mention that saving them wasn't heroism but obligation, the most basic requirement of combat leadership. Charles Carey died in action on January 9, 1945, less than 3 weeks after the actions that earned him the Medal of Honor. He was 29 years old. His citation mentions that he destroyed multiple tanks and killed numerous enemy soldiers. It doesn't mention that he knew he was using the bazooka in ways that violated Doctrine, that he understood the risk of engaging armor at close range, that he did it anyway because the tactical situation required someone to do something impossible. The Medal of Honor was presented to his family posthumously. His mother accepted it at a ceremony in 1945. She said Charles had written letters home, describing the fighting, but never mentioning the danger. He wrote about his men, about the weather, about hoping the war would end soon so he could come home. The letters stopped arriving in January. The Tiger tank became a legend, not because of what it achieved, though it achieved considerable tactical success in the hands of skilled crews, but because of what it represented. The culmination of German armor design philosophy, the idea that sufficient protection and firepower could dominate the battlefield. The bazooka became a footnote, one tool among many in the American arsenal, rarely mentioned in histories of armored warfare. But to the soldiers who carried it into combat against impossible odds, the bazooka was the weapon that let them fight back. It wasn't about honor or glory. It was about having a tool that could kill the thing trying to kill you, if you were willing to get close enough to use it. The final accounting. By the end of the war in Europe, American forces had destroyed or captured over 400 Tiger tanks through all causes: air attack, artillery, tank combat, mechanical failure, and crew abandonment. How many of those 400 were knocked out specifically by bazookas? The records don't specify. The after-action reports list destroyed by anti-tank weapons without distinguishing between 57mm guns, 76mm guns, 90mm guns, and bazookas. Veteran testimonies provide anecdotes, specific incidents where specific soldiers with specific weapons achieved specific results. But anecdotes don't add up to statistics. What we know for certain, dozens of documented cases where individual soldiers used bazookas to kill or disable tigers. Hundreds of cases where bazookas disabled tracks, damaged vision ports, killed crew members, or forced withdrawals. Thousands of cases where the mere presence of bazookas in American infantry squads altered German tactical decisions, made their crews more cautious, reduced their effectiveness. The bazooka's impact wasn't just the tanks it destroyed. It was the tanks that didn't advance because the crews knew what waited for them in those buildings and tree lanes. In 2026, 82 years after the actions at Carano and Malmedy and Falaise, there are no living American veterans of World War II combat in Europe. The men who carried bazookas against tigers are gone. What remains are the stories, the after-action reports, the Medal of Honor citations, the technical specifications in fading manuals. What remains is the knowledge that a weapon dismissed as ineffective by experts proved effective in the hands of soldiers willing to use it at ranges where effectiveness meant exposing yourself to fire from the thing you were trying to kill. The Germans called it unfair because it undermined their advantage. The Americans called it necessary because they needed something that worked. The soldiers who used it called it nothing special, just another tool like the rifle and the grenade and the entrenching shovel. You carried it because it was issued. You learned to use it because the alternative was not having it when you needed it. And when a tiger appeared and your sergeant handed you the tube and told you to get close enough for a shot, you did it. Not because you were brave, because the man next to you was depending on you to do your job. And doing your job meant accepting the manual was wrong about engagement ranges, wrong about frontal armor being impenetrable, wrong about what was possible when doctrine met desperation. Van Barfoot, late in his life, was asked by a reporter what the Medal of Honor meant to him. He thought about it for a long moment. Then he said, "It means other men went home to their families because of what I did that day. That's all it means. That's everything it means." The bazooka was unfair the way war is unfair, not in the sense of violating rules, but in the sense of creating situations where raw courage could overcome technical superiority, where a $25 weapon in the hands of a determined soldier could kill a $500,000 tank, where the side with better logistics and more willingness to accept risk could defeat the side with better engineering. The Germans were right to call unfair. They just didn't understand that fairness was never the point. Winning was the point. Going home alive was the point. The bazooka was a tool that made both possible 2 seconds at a time, at ranges measuring yards instead of hundreds of yards, by men who knew the manual said not to do it, and did it anyway because the alternative was unacceptable.